There are lots of ways to use brand colors. Just be careful not to go overboard or ignore basic design standards. Avoid common pitfalls like colors that vibrate or threaten to overwhelm your design. Make sure to include neutrals in your color palette, like black, gray, white, or off-white. Text is one of the simpler aspects of identity, but it can be surprisingly expressive. All it takes is a different font, and you can subtly, or not so subtly, change the entire look of your brand. Most brands choose 2 to 3 fonts, often inspired by the logo, for basic everyday use. Creative fonts should also be chosen with care and should be a reflection of your unique visual identity. There are certain fonts that professionals know to avoid, fonts that were once popular but are now considered outdated and overused. When in doubt, a more timeless, understated font is less likely to detract from your message. Your font choice should complement your brand, but still be current and professional. Images are a huge part of building a unique identity. Every photo, graphic, icon, and button is a chance to showcase your brand and shape the way that it's perceived. In professional settings, images are usually created specifically for the brand. For instance, pictures in a catalog or graphics in an app. Beginners can get similar results by choosing images with a subtle through line, like a signature color, a shared subject, or a consistent graphic style. Most importantly, avoid images that feel generic or obviously staged. This is difficult if you're relying on third-party stock, but there are ways to set your brand apart. Avoid images that lack context or appear frequently in other brands' designs. Instead, choose images that seem genuine and feature authentic people, places, and things. Visual identity isn't just a marketing tool. It's a way of looking at design that removes a lot of the guesswork. With a clear vision of your brand, you know exactly what colors, fonts, and images to use. You can create consistent works that viewers will remember. Thanks for joining us for the basics of branding and identity. Check out the rest of our design topics, including color, typography, and more.
Goodwill Community Foundation, creating opportunities for a better life.
The fundamentals of design are the basis of every visual medium, from fine art to modern web design. Even small details, like the fonts that make up most compositions. What do these examples have in common? Some very basic elements, including line, shape, form, texture, and balance. They might not seem like much on their own, but together, they're part of almost everything we see and create. The fundamentals can be intimidating, especially if you don't consider yourself an artist. However, there's a lot they can teach you about working with different assets and creating simple visuals from scratch. Let's start at the beginning with one of the most basic elements of all, the line. A line is a shape that connects 2 or more points. It can be fat or thin, wavy or jagged. Every possibility gives the line a slightly different feel. Lines appear frequently in design, for example in drawings and illustrations, and graphic elements like textures and patterns. They're also common in text compositions, where they can add emphasis, divide or organize content, or even guide the viewer's eye. When working with lines, pay attention to things like weight, color, texture, and style. These subtle qualities can have a big impact on the way your design is perceived. Look for places where lines are hiding in plain sight, for example in text. Even here, experimenting with different line qualities can give you very different results. A shape is any two-dimensional area with a recognizable boundary. This includes circles, squares, triangles, and so on. Shapes fall into 2 distinct categories, geometric, or regular, and organic, where the shapes are more freeform. Shapes are a vital part of communicating ideas visually. They give images heft and make them recognizable. We understand street signs, symbols, and even abstract art largely because of shapes. Shapes have a surprising number of uses in everyday design. They can help you organize or separate content, create simple illustrations, or just add interest to your work. Shapes are important because they're the foundation of so many things. Learn to look for them in other designs, and soon you'll start seeing them everywhere. When a shape becomes 3D, we call it a form. Forms can be three-dimensional and exist in the real world, or they can be implied, using techniques like light, shadow, and perspective to create the illusion of depth. In two-dimensional design, form makes realism possible. Without it, a bouncing rubber ball is just a circle. A 3D building is just a series of rectangles. Even flat designs use subtle techniques to hint at form and depth. In everyday compositions, the purpose of form is the same, but on a smaller scale. For example, a simple shadow can create the illusion of layers, or give an object a sense of place. Basic forms can bring a touch of realism to your work, a powerful tool when used in moderation. Texture is the physical quality of a surface. Like form, it can be three-dimensional, something you can see and touch, or it can be implied, suggesting that it would have texture if it existed in real life. In design, texture adds depth and tactility to otherwise flat images. Objects can appear smooth, rough, hard, or soft, depending on the elements at play. For beginners, textures make great background images and can add a lot of interest to your work. Look closely, and you may find texture in unexpected places, like distressed fonts and smooth, glossy icons. Just be careful not to go overboard. Too much texture in a single design can quickly become overwhelming. Balance is the equal distribution of visual weight. In other words, how much any one thing attracts the viewer's eye. Balance can be affected by many things, including color, size, number, and negative space. Mastering balance can be tricky for beginners because it does take some intuition. Luckily, the design world is full of examples that can help you understand its different iterations. Symmetrical designs are the same or similar on both sides of an axis. They feel balanced because each side is effectively the same, if not identical. Asymmetrical designs are different, but the weight is still evenly distributed. The composition is balanced because it calls attention to the right things. Many people use a strategy called the rule of thirds. This imagines your work area divided into a 3x3 grid. The focal point of the image is placed on or near one of these lines, creating visual balance with the rest of the space. We find this type of composition appealing because, according to studies, the human eye naturally follows this path when scanning a design. The fundamentals of design are all about the bigger picture. In other words, learning to appreciate the many small details that make up every composition. This insight can be applied to almost any type of project, whether you're creating your own graphics or just looking for simple ways to enhance your work. Thanks for joining us for the fundamentals of design. Check out the rest of our design topics, including color, typography, and more.
Goodwill Community Foundation, creating opportunities for a better life.
Color. It plays a vital role in design and everyday life. It can draw your eye to an image, evoke a certain mood or emotion, even communicate something important without using words at all. So how do we know which colors look good together and which ones don't? The answer is simple: color theory. Artists and designers have followed color theory for centuries, but anyone can learn more about it. It can help you feel confident in many different situations. whether it's choosing colors for a design or putting together the perfect outfit. All it takes is a little insight, and you'll be looking at color in a whole new way. Let's start at the beginning, the very beginning, with a refresher on the basics. Remember learning about primary and secondary colors in school? Then you already have some knowledge of color theory. Red and yellow make orange, yellow and blue make green, and blue and red make purple. If we mix these colors together, we get even more in-between shades, like red-orange and yellow-green. Altogether, they form what's called a color wheel. You can probably see where it gets its name. Now, let's take it one step further with hue, saturation, and value. These are terms you might never see in daily life, but they're the key to understanding more nuanced colors, like all those little paint chips at the home improvement store. Hue is the easiest one. It's basically just another word for color. Saturation refers to intensity. In other words, whether the color appears more subtle or more vibrant. Value has to do with how dark or light the color is, ranging from black to white. As you can see, this gives us many different shades, from a deep reddish brown to light pastel pink. So how do we put this all together to create professional-looking color schemes? There are actually tried and true formulas based on something called color harmony that can help. All you need is the color wheel. The easiest formula for harmony is monochromatic because it only uses one color or hue. Just pick a spot on the color wheel and use your knowledge of saturation and value to create variations. The best thing about monochromatic color schemes is that they're guaranteed to match. An analogous color scheme uses colors that are next to each other on the wheel, like reds and oranges, or cooler colors like blues and greens. Don't be afraid to play with the palette and create your own unique interpretation. That's what these formulas really are, merely starting points to help guide and inspire you. Complementary colors are opposite each other on the wheel, for instance, blue and orange, or the classic red and green. To avoid complementary color schemes that are too simplistic, add some variety by introducing lighter, darker, or desaturated tones. A split complementary color scheme uses the colors on either side of the complement. This gives you the same level of contrast, but more colors to work with, and potentially more interesting results. A triadic color scheme uses 3 colors that are evenly spaced, forming a perfect triangle on the wheel. These combinations tend to be pretty striking, especially with primary or secondary colors, so be mindful when using them in your work. Tetradic color schemes form a rectangle on the wheel, using not 1 but 2 complementary color pairs. This formula works best if you let one color dominate while the others serve as an accent. There are a few classic do's and don'ts when it comes to color. For instance, have you ever seen colors that seem to vibrate when they're placed next to each other? The solution is to tone it down, literally, and there's a simple way to do it. Start with one color and try adjusting its lightness, darkness, or saturation. Sometimes a little contrast is all your color palette needs. Readability is an important factor in any design. Your colors should be legible, engaging, and easy on the eyes. Sometimes that means not using color, at least not in every little detail. Neutral colors like black, white, and gray can help you balance your design, so when you do use color, it really stands out. Every color sends a message. It's important to consider the tone of your project and choose a color palette that fits. For example, bright colors tend to have a fun or modern vibe. Desaturated colors often appear more businesslike. Sometimes it just depends on the context. You'd be surprised how flexible color can be. You can find ideas for color schemes in all kinds of interesting places, from advertising and branding to famous works of art. You can even use a web resource to browse color palettes or generate your own. Even experienced designers take inspiration from the world around them. There's nothing wrong with finding something you like and making it your own. Everywhere you look, there's color, color, and more color. It can be intimidating to use it in your work, but it doesn't have to be. Just keep experimenting and remember what you've learned about color theory. Soon, choosing great-looking colors will feel like second nature. We hope you enjoyed learning the basics of color. Check out the rest of our design topics, including typography, images, and composition. Typography. It's everywhere we look. In the books we read, on the websites we visit, even in everyday life, on street signs, bumper stickers, and product packaging. Simply put, typography is the style or appearance of text. It can also refer to the art of working with text, something you probably do all the time if you create documents or other projects for work, school, or yourself. Typography can be an intimidating subject, but it doesn't have to be. You only need to know a little to make a big difference in the stuff you do every day. So let's get started. First, some common types of fonts and what you need to know about them. Serif fonts have little strokes called serifs attached to the main part of the letter. Because of their classic look, they're a good choice for more traditional projects. They're also common in print publications, like magazines and newspapers. Sans serif fonts don't have that extra stroke, hence the name, which is French for without serif. This style is considered more clean and modern than serif fonts. Also, it tends to be easier to read on computer screens, including smartphones and tablets. Display fonts come in many different styles, like script, black letter, all caps, and just plain fancy. Because of their decorative nature, display fonts are best for small amounts of text. For example, titles and headers, and more graphic-heavy designs. In a way, fonts have their own language. They all have something to say beyond the words on the page. They can come across as casual or neutral, exotic or graphic. That's why it's important to think about your message and pick a font that fits. Some fonts come with extra baggage, like Comic Sans, Curls, Papyrus, and many more. There's nothing particularly wrong with these fonts. They just have a certain reputation for being outdated and overused. If you find yourself tempted by them, think twice and consider using something else. There are many fonts with a similar look and feel that are less likely to detract from your message. When deciding which fonts to use, less is more. It's best to limit yourself to 1 or 2 per project. If you need more contrast, try repeating one of your fonts in a different size, weight, or style. This trick is practically foolproof for creating interesting combinations that work. You've probably heard the saying, opposites attract. Well, the same is true for fonts. Don't be afraid to combine font styles that are different but complementary, like sans serif with serif, short with tall, or decorative with simple. This can be challenging at first, but don't despair. Look to other designs for inspiration, and soon you'll get the hang of it. Maybe you've heard terms like kerning, leading, tracking, and hierarchy. For those with more experience, these concepts are essential for creating professional-looking designs. As a beginner, you don't need to know everything about these terms, just enough to inform your work and help you talk about design with more confidence. Hierarchy is used to guide the reader's eye to whatever is most important. In other words, it shows them where to begin and where to go next using different levels of emphasis. Establishing hierarchy is simple. Just decide which elements you want the reader to notice first, then make them stand out. High-level items are usually larger, bolder, or different in some way. Remember to keep it simple and stick to just a few complementary styles. Leading is the space between lines of text, also known as line spacing. If you're not sure how much line spacing to use, don't fret. The default is usually fine. The goal is to make your text as comfortable to read as possible. Too much or too little spacing can make things unpleasant for the reader. Tracking is the overall space between characters, sometimes called character spacing. Most programs let you condense or expand this depending on your needs. In some designs, you might adjust your tracking to create a certain artistic effect. It can also help you fix fonts that are poorly spaced to begin with. Kerning is the space between specific characters. Unlike tracking, it varies over the course of the word because each letter fits together differently. Some fonts have what we call bad kerning, making certain letters look improperly spaced. If a font you're using has bad kerning, it's best to cut your losses and choose something else. Well-crafted text can mean the difference between an ordinary project and an extraordinary project, even if you're just getting started with design. All it takes is an interest in typography, and you'll start to notice more, see more, and be able to do more in your own work. We hope you enjoyed learning the basics of typography. Check out the rest of our design topics, including color, images, and composition. Images. No matter what the subject, we're naturally drawn to them. From beautiful high-definition photos to carefully crafted illustrations. Even simple examples like logos and icons. Images are more than just decoration. In design, they're the hook that draws the viewer in. Compelling visuals can help you connect with the audience and make a strong impression before they've even read a single word. You don't have to be an artist to use images in your work. All it takes is a little creativity and a willingness to think outside the box. With the right resources, you can learn to set your designs apart. First, finding high-quality images for any type of project. Maybe you're handy with a camera or have some graphic design experience. That's great. If not, don't panic. There are countless sources online that offer images for exactly this purpose. The truth is, most people, including professionals, rely on free or low-cost images called stock. Stock is perfect when you need something specific, for example, a photo of a tiny dog in a teacup, and you don't have the time or resources to make it yourself. Most stock image sites let you browse or search their offerings. Look for results that are relevant to your project, but also unique in some way. As viewers, people are naturally drawn to images that feel authentic. For example, distinct but believable photos, and graphics that tell a story. The best images are somewhat open-ended. They set the tone for your project, but leave room for interpretation. Some stock images are just too generic to be effective. For instance, how many times have you seen a business presentation with something like this? For a more modern, professional design, avoid images that lack context or are too literal in meaning. Instead, look for imagery that's connected to your work, but in a more subtle, relatable way. Of course, it's not just about content. There's also a technical side to images, which can have a big impact on your work. It doesn't matter if the photo you've chosen is absolutely perfect in every other way. If it's blurry or pixelated, it could give the wrong impression. Look for high-quality images that are sharp, clear, and free of distortion. In general, bigger is better because it gives you more to work with. A large, high-resolution image can always be cropped or sized down, depending on the needs of the project. Unfortunately, it doesn't work the other way around. If you enlarge a smaller image, it immediately loses quality. That's because most images are in something called raster format. They're made up of thousands, sometimes even millions, of tiny little pixels. When you view a raster image at its original size or smaller, the pixels are invisible. They're just too small to see. But if you zoom in or enlarge it, the results aren't pretty. Vector graphics are quite different from raster. You can make them any size, big or small, without losing any quality. That's because they're made of typography. It's everywhere we look. In the books we read, on the websites we visit, even in everyday life, on street signs, bumper stickers, and product packaging. Simply put, typography is the style or appearance of text. It can also refer to the art of working with text, something you probably do all the time if you create documents or other projects for work, school, or yourself. Typography can be an intimidating subject, but it doesn't have to be. You only need to know a little to make a big difference in the stuff you do every day. So let's get started. First, some common types of fonts and what you need to know about them. Serif fonts have little strokes called serifs attached to the main part of the letter. Because of their classic look, they're a good choice for more traditional projects. They're also common in print publications, like magazines and newspapers. Sans serif fonts don't have that extra stroke, hence the name, which is French for without serif. This style is considered more clean and modern than serif fonts. Also, it tends to be easier to read on computer screens, including smartphones and tablets. Display fonts come in many different styles, like script, black letter, all caps, and just plain fancy. Because of their decorative nature, display fonts are best for small amounts of text. For example, titles and headers, and more graphic-heavy designs. In a way, fonts have their own language. They all have something to say beyond the words on the page. They can come across as casual or neutral, exotic or graphic. That's why it's important to think about your message and pick a font that fits. Some fonts come with extra baggage, like Comic Sans, Curls, Papyrus, and many more. There's nothing particularly wrong with these fonts. They just have a certain reputation for being outdated and overused. If you find yourself tempted by them, think twice and consider using something else. There are many fonts with a similar look and feel that are less likely to detract from your message. When deciding which fonts to use, less is more. It's best to limit yourself to 1 or 2 per project. If you need more contrast, try repeating one of your fonts in a different size, weight, or style. This trick is practically foolproof for creating interesting combinations that work. You've probably heard the saying, opposites attract. Well, the same is true for fonts. Don't be afraid to combine font styles that are different but complementary, like sans serif with serif, short with tall, or decorative with simple. This can be challenging at first, but don't despair. Look to other designs for inspiration, and soon you'll get the hang of it. Maybe you've heard terms like kerning, leading, tracking, and hierarchy. For those with more experience, these concepts are essential for creating professional-looking designs. As a beginner, you don't need to know everything about these terms, just enough to inform your work and help you talk about design with more confidence. Hierarchy is used to guide the reader's eye to whatever is most important. In other words, it shows them where to begin and where to go next, using different levels of emphasis. Establishing hierarchy is simple. Just decide which elements you want the reader to notice first, then make them stand out. High-level items are usually larger, bolder, or different in some way. Remember to keep it simple and stick to just a few complementary styles. Leading is the space between lines of text, also known as line spacing. If you're not sure how much line spacing to use, don't fret. The default is usually fine. The goal is to make your text as comfortable to read as possible. Too much or too little spacing can make things unpleasant for the reader. Tracking is the overall space between characters, sometimes called character spacing. Most programs let you condense or expand this depending on your needs. In some designs, you might adjust your tracking to create a certain artistic effect. It can also help you fix fonts that are poorly spaced to begin with. Kerning is the space between specific characters. Unlike tracking, it varies over the course of the word because each letter fits together differently. Some fonts have what we call bad kerning, making certain letters look improperly spaced. If a font you're using has bad kerning, it's best to cut your losses and choose something else. Well-crafted text can mean the difference between an ordinary project and an extraordinary project, even if you're just getting started with design. All it takes is an interest in typography, and you'll start to notice more, see more, and be able to do more in your own work. We hope you enjoyed learning the basics of typography. Check out the rest of our design topics, including color, images, and composition. Images. No matter what the subject, we're naturally drawn to them. From beautiful high-definition photos to carefully crafted illustrations. Even simple examples like logos and icons. Images are more than just decoration. In design, they're the hook that draws the viewer in. Compelling visuals can help you connect with the audience and make a strong impression before they've even read a single word. You don't have to be an artist to use images in your work. All it takes is a little creativity and a willingness to think outside the box. With the right resources, you can learn to set your designs apart. First, finding high-quality images for any type of project. Maybe you're handy with a camera or have some graphic design experience. That's great. If not, don't panic. There are countless sources online that offer images for exactly this purpose. The truth is, most people, including professionals, rely on free or low-cost images called stock. Stock is perfect when you need something specific, for example, a photo of a tiny dog in a teacup, and you don't have the time or resources to make it yourself.
Composition.
Most stock image sites let you browse or search their offerings. Look for results that are relevant to your project, but also unique in some way. As viewers, people are naturally drawn to images that feel authentic. For example, distinct but believable photos, and graphics that tell a story. The best images are somewhat open-ended. They set the tone for your project, but leave room for interpretation. Some stock images are just too generic to be effective. For instance, how many times have you seen a business presentation with something like this? For a more modern, professional design, avoid images that lack context or are too literal in meaning. Instead, look for imagery that's connected to your work, but in a more subtle, relatable way. Of course, it's not just about content. There's also a technical side to images, which can have a big impact on your work. It doesn't matter if the photo you've chosen is absolutely perfect in every other way. If it's blurry or pixelated, it could give the wrong impression. Look for high-quality images that are sharp, clear, and free of distortion. In general, bigger is better because it gives you more to work with. A large, high-resolution image can always be cropped or sized down, depending on the needs of the project. Unfortunately, it doesn't work the other way around. If you enlarge a smaller image, it immediately loses quality. That's because most images are in something called raster format. They're made up of thousands, sometimes even millions, of tiny little pixels. When you view a raster image at its original size or smaller, the pixels are invisible. They're just too small to see. But if you zoom in or enlarge it, the results aren't pretty. Vector graphics are quite different from raster. You can make them any size, big or small, without losing any quality. That's because they're made of something more complex than pixels. They're rendered using a special form of geometry. You're not likely to find vector graphics outside of professional design settings, but it's good to know what they are. Few stock images are perfect as is, even if they're technically high quality. Maybe the image is the wrong size, or the colors could use some work. Fortunately, even basic programs let you make simple adjustments nowadays. Look for these options the next time you need to fix or enhance an image. Cropping can be used to change the size, shape, or focus of an image, making it useful in many different situations. Try this feature if your graphic is the wrong dimensions, or if it includes something you'd rather cut out. Cosmetic adjustments let you enhance certain image qualities, like brightness, contrast, saturation, and color. If your favorite program offers filters or presets, you can change your image dramatically with very little time and effort. Resizing an image will ensure it's the perfect fit for your project. Just remember, you can't make images bigger than their original size without affecting their quality. If the image you're working with simply isn't big enough, it's best to choose something else. Alternatively, find a creative way to work with the image you have. Adding photos, graphics, and other visuals to your work is a great way to make it more engaging. Even a simple background image can transform your design into something special. Just remember what you've learned about image quality, both technical and conceptual, and your work is sure to stand out for the right reasons. We hope you enjoyed learning the basics of images. Check out the rest of our design topics, including typography, color, and composition. Layout and composition. In a way, they're the foundation of design. They give your work structure and make it easier to navigate, from the margins on the sides to the content in between. Of course, it's not just about working with text. Composition matters in other mediums too, like graphic design, web design, and much more. Without a well-composed layout, your work would basically fall apart. The key to mastering layout and composition is to think like a designer. Luckily, it's easier than it sounds. There are 5 basic principles that can help you transform your work and sharpen your eye for design. Let's start at the top and work our way down. Proximity is all about using visual space to show relationships in your content. In practice, it's pretty simple. All you have to do is make sure related items are grouped together. For example, blocks of text or elements in a graphic. Groups that are not related to each other should be separated to visually emphasize their lack of a relationship. All in all, this makes your work easier to understand at a glance, whether it's purely text or something more visual. White space is an important part of every composition. Now, this doesn't mean literal white space. It just means negative space, like the spaces between your content, between lines, and even the outer margins. There's no one way to use white space correctly, but it's good to understand its purpose. White space helps you define and separate different sections. It gives your content room to breathe. If your work ever starts to feel cluttered or uncomfortable, a little white space might be just what the doctor ordered. Alignment is something you deal with all the time, even if you don't realize it. Whenever you type an email or create a document, the text is aligned automatically. When aligning objects by yourself, for instance, images or separate text boxes, getting it right can be tricky. The most important thing is to be consistent. Let's take a look at what that means. It might help to imagine your content arranged inside of a grid. Notice how there's an invisible line centering each image to the text? Each grouping is also evenly spaced and aligned, with equal-sized margins. It's that attention to detail that makes the composition easier to navigate. Without consistent alignment, your work could start to feel disorganized. Contrast simply means that one item is different from another. In layout and composition, contrast can help you do many things. For example, catch the reader's eye, create emphasis, or call attention to something important. There are lots of strategies for creating contrast. You can use color, adjust the size, shape, or visual weight of an object, or use contrasting styles of text. Contrast is also closely tied to hierarchy, a visual technique that can help the viewer navigate your work. In other words, it shows them where to begin and where to go next using different levels of emphasis. Establishing hierarchy is simple. Just decide which elements you want the reader to notice first, then make them stand out. High-level or important items are usually larger, bolder, or more eye-catching in some way. Repetition is a reminder that every project should have a consistent look and feel. That means finding ways to reinforce your design by repeating or echoing certain elements. For instance, if you have a specific color palette, look for ways to carry it through. If you've chosen a special header style, use it every time. It's not just for aesthetic reasons. Being consistent can also make your work easier to read. When the viewer knows what to expect, they can relax and focus on the content. In many ways, layout and composition are the unsung heroes of design. It's easy to overlook their role, but they're part of everything you do. A nudge here, some extra white space there, and voila! With a little attention to detail, you can create beautiful, professional-looking compositions. Thanks for joining us for the basics of layout and composition. Check out the rest of our design topics, including typography, color, and images. Joining us for basics of composition. Check out the rest of our design, including typography, color, and images.
How we define print production, I think, is based a lot on who you ask. I think if you ask a designer to define print production, the answer is going to come from more of a creative standpoint, like taking an idea and creating something that is visually stimulating and engaging, and then working with a print service provider to actually produce the job. On the other hand, if you ask a printer, defining print production is really more about the manufacture of the job. To a printer, a perfect job is really not about how the design looks, but how well it was set up for the production process, like printing and folding and binding. As a designer, you've already been trained in the art of visual communications and can create visually appealing designs. But to take your design to the next level, designing and building files that fold, trim, print, and finish properly, you need to have a core understanding of the print reproduction process. And the good news is, to achieve this, you don't need to be an expert press operator or a pre-press operator. You just need to know some basic concepts and what questions to ask your printer. Make no mistake, printers absolutely love designers who are inquisitive about the print production process. They want to work with you to make sure that your files are the very best that they can be. In this course, we're going to cover many real-world examples using both visuals and hand-on exercise files so you can take your designs to the next level by considering the most critical aspects of the print production process when creating your next job. When it comes to the print production process, there are clearly defined roles for both the designer and the printer. For you as the designer, you have to determine the scope of the job. You're, of course, advising your client throughout the process. You determine the message, and you create the design to convey the message. You'll send the completed digital files of the job off to the printer. You're going to approve the proof that the printer sends to you, and then you might attend a press check. As far as the printer roles and responsibilities, the printer will help you as the designer choose the right paper stock for the design, as well as the ink, for the printing process and to fit your budget. Based on the job run length, format, size, budget, and other criteria, the printer will also help you determine the best printing process for the job. The printer also will provide a schedule of when certain job milestones are met, including creation of proofs, the press run, and job delivery. When you send your digital files to the printer must make sure that those files are print ready. What you see on your screen isn't necessarily what you're going to get when the job is printed. And these potential issues are uncovered during the pre-flighting process. The printer is also going to provide proofs to you. The proofs are created by a printer, and they are a prediction of what will eventually be printed on press. Then, of course, the printer also produces the job. This could include things like printing, finishing, or mailing services. One type of printing is packaging and label printing. The primary printing process that would be used for these products is called flexography. Flexography is a very versatile printing process and a perfect fit for packaging because, if you think about it, packaging materials run the gamut. Everything from paper to paperboard to foils to plastics and so on. And because most of the products produced using flexography wind up on the store shelves, color accuracy is going to be critical because it's portraying a particular brand. If you have a need to produce packaging, you'll probably have to seek out a printer who specializes in this type of printing. Finally, it should also be noted that some packaging can indeed be printed using other processes that we'll be talking about in a minute, like digital printing and offset lithography. But the vast majority of packaging products are produced using the flexographic printing process. Another printing process is screen printing. Screen printing is also a very versatile process in that not only can you print on a wide variety of materials, you can also print on oddly shaped objects, things like coffee mugs, thumb drives, flag banners, t-shirts, and more. Like flexography, if you have the need to print on these types of materials, then you'll have to seek out a printer who specializes in this particular segment. It should also be noted that depending upon the product and quantity needed, some of the products mentioned here can also be produced using digital processes, such as inkjet. Products such as newspapers, envelopes, brochures, business cards, books, magazines, postcards, and more can be printed using offset lithography. Alternate terms you might hear when it comes to this type of printing is simply offset, or offset printing, or even commercial printing. Offset lithography is the most popular printing process, and using this process you can print on a fairly wide variety of materials. Again, depending upon the quantity needed and the job requirement, it is entirely possible to print many of these same products using digital printing. Finally, most printers who offer offset printing also offer digital printing to augment this type of work for their customers. Finally, we have digital printing, which could be produced using toner or inkjet presses. Digital printing is very versatile in that it is very economical for smaller job quantities. Like in this example, if you have the need to produce several hundred or maybe 1,000 of the same product, digital printing would be a good fit and probably the least expensive way to produce this job. The job example that you see here is what we call static printing. And what static printing means is that we're producing the same exact piece over and over and over again, and nothing on this sheet changes from one sheet to the next. This kind of printing is not really targeted or customized in any way, which is a big advantage of digital printing. Like you see here. Here you see personalized variable data printing, more commonly referred to as VDP for short. Personalized, meaning that in this example, the person's name may be incorporated within the design with a relevant offer. This is better than static printing in that it speaks to the end user, typically by incorporating his or her name in the printed piece. But this is still a pretty generic form of VDP. We see this all the time, as name changes on printed pieces are pretty common and not terribly unique. Okay, now this is customized variable data digital printing. This is the holy grail when it comes to digital printing. This is a very intelligent printed piece. It incorporates a person's name with a very specific product that they're interested in. In this example, based on a product that the customer likes, we're not only changing the name, but also the image in each and the message. This is intelligent variable data and is the most complex form of VDP and design. But as you can see, it is also very effective. This also requires more in-depth information from your customer's database than just names and addresses. Here, we need to know the type of food that the customer likes the most. As you can see, there's a place for each printing process based on your needs and your customer's needs. The diversity of printed products in our world necessitates the existence of all the printing processes that we've discussed. Regardless of the printing process used, the main key to success as a designer, and you're going to hear this a lot throughout this course, is communicating effectively and often with your printer. Defining a product for print can run the gamut, of course, especially when it comes to complexity. We can have a very simple, straightforward job like a business card or a single color half-fold document, all the way up to something that is very complex, like a multicolor job with die cutting and specialty finishing effects like varnish or foil. In this section, we'll cover the essentials when it comes to defining the product to be printed, but keep in mind there could be more or less to consider based on the complexity. The first decision that you have to make is whether the job will be static or variable printing. If it's static and you need a large quantity, or if the physical size of the job requires a very large sheet, it will probably not be produced using a digital printing process, but probably offset. However, if the job is variable, where each and every sheet that is printed will be unique, like a name change, then it will be produced using a digital process like toner or inkjet printing. If you have an extremely complex variable data printing job, your printer has both the software and expertise to help you with this. So again, you'll want to reach out and have a conversation with your printer about how they can assist you. You'll also need to specify the size, the page count, and the quantity. Paper comes in standard sizes, and specifying odd sizes can impact the cost of the job and affect your budget. More paper means more additional setup and press time, which can definitely add cost to the job. Standard sizes such as 5.5 by 8.5, 8.5 by 11, or 11 by 17 tend to be the most cost-effective. So before you begin designing a job that's a non-standard size, it literally pays to check with your printer. They can help you decide the best course of action to fit your design and vision with your budget requirements. Considerations when designing your job for the finished size include the live area, the trim, and the bleed. So trim, of course, represents the final trim size of the job. The live area is the area that is deemed as a safe zone for text and images, and this area will vary based on what you're printing and how the job will be produced. Because of minute but normal imperfections in the print production process, there's movement in the printing and finishing and binding of the final job. So any important items to be placed outside of the live area, page numbers or phone numbers, for example, can run the risk of being cut off during the finishing process or disappearing into the spine if the piece is going to be bound. So it's really always best to keep important items within the live area, and a good rule of thumb is not to place important text or graphics, unless they bleed, within 1/4 inch of the edge of the page. Remember that the live area will be different for each job depending upon the paper, the page count, and the kind of binding method being used. So check with your printer if this is a concern. And then finally, there's the bleed margin. And bleed is actually one of the most common issues with file design and preparation. So here you see two examples of a page in a document. The one on the left has bleeds, while the one on the right doesn't. And bleed is printing that goes beyond the edge of where the sheet will be trimmed. In other words, the bleed is the area to be trimmed off. Artwork and background colors often extend into the bleed area. So after trimming, the bleed ensures that no unprinted edges of paper will occur in the final trim document. 1/8 of an inch of bleed is typical for most jobs and enough to compensate for variations during the printing and finishing process. Next, you'll want to specify how many colors are needed to produce your job. And the more colors you need, the more expensive the job will be. Printing black only is most cost-effective, but for sure it's not the most visually appealing in most cases. Adding a spot color ink or special color, which we'll talk about a little bit later, adds visual appeal, but also begins to add cost. The vast majority of print jobs are produced using 4-color process, or cyan, magenta, yellow, and black printing inks, or toners. But you can also add additional colors to 4-color process printing, like a spot color or a gloss or dull varnish. Make sure that if you're adding additional spot color inks or varnishes, that you check with your printer to make sure that they have that capability. It's your job. Paper usually represents the single most expensive material cost. So when specifying paper, there are some major considerations, 3 major considerations for you to be aware of. One is paper weight, another is the paper coating, and finally the paper color. Paper comes in a variety of weights, sizes, and textures for office applications and creative print jobs. There are 2 primary methods to distinguish the weight of paper. One is US basis weight, and the other is metric weight. The US basis weight method represents a measurement of the weight of 500 sheets of paper in its uncut form at its basic size. The basic size varies based on the type of paper, which actually can make this way of specifying paper quite confusing. The metric weight method is much more straightforward. It's represented as the weight of a sheet of paper cut to a 1 meter by 1 meter square and is specified as grams per square meter, or GSM. Because of the size of the weighted paper is always the same, this provides a more clear-cut comparison between the different paper weights. I know this is a lot, but it is important for you to understand some of the basic terminology here. And for that, based on the paper and the weight that you choose, it may be limiting the printing process that can be used to produce your job. For example, if you specify a very, very heavy paper stock, there's a chance that it may be beyond the capability for a digital press. So in this case, even if the job is short run and a better fit for digital, because the paper weight is too heavy, it'll have to be produced using offset printing, which will surely impact the cost of the job. Some paper stock may receive a coating as part of the paper manufacturing process, and this coating creates a bright surface that is ideal for image and color reproduction. And coated paper can have several finishes, including gloss, matte, satin, dull, and velvet. Paper is available with the coating on a single side or on both sides. Although coated paper provides better image reproduction, uncoated paper is more widespread in use, mainly because it's cheaper. You might choose uncoated stock for projects that have to be easier to read for prolonged periods of time. And unlike coated stock, ink applied to uncoated paper will absorb into the stock and affect color reproduction, sharpness, and accuracy. There really aren't any bad choices when it comes to paper stock. The most important thing is to choose the stock that is best for your project and for your budget. Another consideration is paper color. The shade of your paper can play a crucial role in the reproduction of your images. CMYK printing inks are transparent, and this is what allows us to build a lot of different colors using the primary printing ink colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Because the inks are transparent, the color of the paper will impact the final color of what is printed. As you can see here from left to right, the same image looks very different on colored paper stocks. And as you'll discover later, paper has the greatest impact on how good or how bad the color will look when it's printed. The paper actually controls the color produced just as much or even more so than the inks. Will the job you're producing fold? This will have to be properly specified as well. The folded sheet could be the finished product, or it could be an intermediate step in the bindery process, meaning the folded sheet might also eventually be stitched into a magazine or bound into a book. Here we see some common fold types and terminology. Folds can be complicated and have many different panels. You have to consider each panel on a job that has many folds, as each panel won't exactly be the same size once folded. This is a crucial point. If you tell your printer how you want your job to fold before you begin your design, they can provide you with a mock-up with margins and sizes for each panel that you can use for reference during design. Using this will reduce both headaches and delays later in the print reproduction process, and I can assure you your printer will appreciate this. If your project requires binding, you'll have to specify this as well. Saddle stitching is a common way to bind magazines and other thin publications using wire staples at the spine. Saddle stitching is also cost-effective, but you're limited to a maximum number of pages based on the paper thickness and the capabilities of your printer. Also, when saddle stitching, remember that the page count must always be divisible by 4. So when you're designing, think 8 pages, 12 pages, 16 pages, and so on. If you have to bind a project with a high page count, you can use adhesive binding, also called perfect binding. Perfect binding involves applying a hot glue adhesive to the spine of the pages. The pages are trimmed and glued at the spine. Because the pages are glued, your page count can be divisible by 2. The text pages of a perfect bound book are glued to a cover. This binding method is more expensive than saddle stitching, but still relatively inexpensive to bind very thick publications. Finally, there's mechanical binding, such as coil binding. The individual sheets are bound together with wire, coils, or rings made of plastic or metal. This is a great option for books that have a high page count, but also need to lay flat, like manuals or cookbooks. It's interesting that a topic as confusing and complicated as color can have such a simple definition. When we define color, color is a phenomenon of light or a visual sensation. So when we look at this definition, I think it's important to also define what phenomenon is. Phenomenon is known through the senses rather than through thought or intuition. And finally, a theory is an acceptable general principle to explain phenomenon or an unproved assumption. So we think we have a good understanding of the phenomenon of color, but it is still described as theory. All color is contained in white light, so the entire spectrum of color exists there. And light is electromagnetic energy and part of the electromagnetic spectrum. The absence of light is black, so without light, color simply cannot exist. Looking at it another way, if we take white light and pass it through a prism, it would reveal three beams known as the primary colors of light. We've been taught to call these visual sensations the names red, green, and blue. But you see more than red, green, and blue. You see many of other colors when you do this, like purples, oranges, pinks, and so on. These other colors that you see are created by mixing the red, green, and blue light. So as you look around you, every color that you see can be created by some combination of red, green, and blue light. Visible light is the narrow range of electromagnetic energy located near the center of this bigger thing called the electromagnetic spectrum. The human eye is sensitive to only a portion of this electromagnetic range, which we call the visible spectrum. When you look at everything that's on the electromagnetic spectrum, then you look at what we can perceive, what you can see, is that you really can't see very much at all. Visible light is only a very small portion of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. The visible spectrum ranges from approximately 400 nanometers blue to 700 nanometers red. People who can't distinguish the difference between primary colors within this range are color deficient. And there are two major categories of color deficiency. That is red-green deficiency. If you're red-green deficient, you can't tell the difference between red and green objects. This type of color deficiency is most common. There's also blue-yellow deficiency. If you have this, you can't tell the difference between what is blue and what is yellow. This type of color deficiency is pretty rare. It's not a bad thing to be color deficient. It's more important to know if you're color deficient and recognize that you just don't see colors the same way as maybe the average population does. And color deficiency is a problem, but mainly with the male population. About 10% of the male population is color deficient. However, among the female population, it's a different story. Less than 1% of the female population is color deficient, so it's quite rare. And one final consideration, as we age, as we get older, our ability to discern colors is diminished, regardless of your gender. If you've ever wondered what a color deficient person actually sees when they can't see colors that they're deficient in, Photoshop has a really great tool that allows you to preview that. So if you go into the sample files folder that you downloaded along with this course, go ahead and open that folder up and open up the ingredients image in Photoshop. If you go under the View menu and select Proof Setup, down here there's two different color blindness options. There's protanopia and deuteranopia, and people suffering from protanopia are unable to perceive any red light. Those with deuteranopia are unable to perceive green light. So if you click on protanopia, that's what you're going to see if you're color deficient and you can't perceive red. And if you can't perceive green light, if we go under View, Proof Setup, and choose Color Blindness, Deuteranopia, you can see how the image changes and you can't perceive green. So this is a great tool in Photoshop for you to use as you design. If colors are important and you want to reach the greatest population and you want people to be able to at least distinguish tones, if you're designing a logo, for example, you can use this tool to test your design and test your logo design. Because color deficiency is so prevalent, wouldn't you think that it's important for everyone involved in the print production process to take some sort of color deficiency test? Absolutely. How about you, the designer? Have you ever taken a color deficiency test? Maybe the client that you're dealing with is color deficient, and they have no idea. What about the customer service representative or account manager that you're dealing with at your correctly? The more you get incorrect, the more likely you have a deficiency. A more scientific test is the Farnsworth-Munsell test. Here, this test contains 4 rows of similar color hues, each containing 25 distinct variations of each hue. In each row, you have to arrange them by hue color. This is a very complete test, and the score can be entered into a system that compares you with others who have taken the test. Next, let's talk about